Sure. I was just astounded, quite frankly. I didn't even realize how critical muscle mass was for living a healthy lifestyle, for living longer, for surviving diseases, trauma better. The data is honestly kind of unbelievable. And I think a lot of people, myself included, when we go down the road of lifting weights or getting into resistance training or trying to build muscle, a lot of us, it was exclusively for aesthetic purposes. Like, I'm going to be completely honest. When I started lifting weights when I was 15 years old, or I think I was 14, I did so because I wanted to get jacked. Like, I wanted to be muscular for reasons of I wanted to stop getting picked on by bullies and I wanted to get attention from girls. So I started lifting weights for very, very shallow reasons. I started trying to build muscle for very, very shallow reasons. But now at age 43, after 25 plus years of lifting, I have reaped the benefits of lifting weights. And I see this every day when I see people who are my age, who look 10, 15, 20 years older visually, but then also internally are not very healthy either. And my experience is the experience of many people in terms of how they viewed resistance training, building muscle as a kind of purely vanity thing. And when I got into lifting weights in the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, the perception of building muscle was like you were a meathead. You were brainless. You were a jock. You know, this wasn't something that people with brains did. This was something that dumb people did who didn't really have much else to offer. And you see this in like movies and popular TV. Typically, your really muscular guy in a movie or a TV show is not really the most intelligent. In fact, usually the least intelligent. Things have started to change more recently. I mean, my favorite book series of all time is the Jack Reacher book series, and the show is awesome. And obviously, like Jack Reacher in the books and in the show is very muscular, but also extremely intelligent. And as we go through some of this literature, what you're going to find is the reality is closer to Jack Reacher than it is the big dumb oaf who just lifts weights and doesn't have a brain. I don't want to give away too much because there is some fun data to comb through. But this idea that lifting weights is for the brainless is just not supported by data. Now, I can tell you when I went to graduate school circa, 2004 to 2010, there was already a shift starting to happen with lifting weights. But I will tell you, being in a Ph.D. program and being a bodybuilder, a competitive bodybuilder, I definitely still got looks from people. It was definitely not a normal thing. I actually did get a nice compliment by the head of our division when I was graduating. He said, "You got a Ph.D. and you've got arms like that? That's impressive." I think what he means is, it's difficult to get a PhD. It's difficult to build a good physique. To do both, obviously requires a lot of time. I do think this idea still persists that it's kind of one of the two. Either you're going to be a book nerd or a nerdy scientist who's like pencil thin or overweight or whatever, or you're going to be not very academically inclined and you're going to be jacked. And these are kind of your options. And the reality is these are not the options. And then I think it's also important to point out the perception of women, which thankfully is starting to change. I mean, if you go into a gym now, any big box chain gym, I would say there's about as many women in there lifting weights as there are men now. When I first got into training back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, the number of women who were in the gym was definitely lower than men. Most of them, I would say, would be doing cardio or aerobic stuff. And if by chance they were lifting weights, usually they were not doing so with intensity. Now, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because obviously there were women who trained hard back then too. But the current crop of women in the gym are completely different than it was 20 years ago. Where 20 years ago, again, women were encouraged, well, you don't want to look too muscular. You don't want to get too bulky. Lift light weights. You just want to be toned. And, the reality is, I tell people all the time, I have spent my entire adult life trying to get as jacked as possible without drugs, without steroids. And in a t-shirt, I look like an athletic guy. Like, it is unless you have amazing genetics, it is very, very hard to build muscle. And so the likelihood that somebody is just going to randomly become too muscular is like saying, well, I don't want to drive because I might end up driving NASCAR. It's like, no, it's probably not going to happen by accident. So I'm glad to see that some of these ideas about lifting weights are changing with the new generations. But some of these perceptions still persist to this day. And the turn of